If you've been debating whether or not you need a bread machine for gluten-free bread, this is the video for you. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today is a very exciting day for me. It's both my birthday and it's the launch of my brand spankin' new bread course. Finally, I've been working on it for so long. I wanted to share a little snippet of my course content with you. The pros and cons of bread machines for gluten-free bread. The reason that I really wanted to share this video with you is because after my celiac diagnosis, I did a ton of research about gluten-free bread machines. Everything that I read said that a bread machine is a must. So I sought out the top-rated gluten-free bread machine. It turns out that my bread machine was not as helpful as I thought it would be. Believe it or not, my stand mixer was actually the star of the show. But enough chit-chat, let's get on to the video. Take it away, Robin! Let's talk about a very hot topic in the gluten-free community. Bread machines. Spill the tea, Robin. With regular baking, bread machines are an incredible time saver. They do all of the mixing, kneading, rising, punching, rising, punching, rising, punching, and baking, and in a few hours you have a beautiful loaf of bread. The main step that it takes care of, though, that is so time-consuming is the kneading. With gluten-free bread, though, there is no need to knead. And gluten-free bread only requires one rise, which makes the bread machine kind of unnecessary. Oh, shocking. And it doesn't necessarily save you any time or effort, which I'll discuss in a moment. In my opinion, a stand mixer is a much better investment than a bread machine because it's way more versatile. You can use it for bread and cookies and cakes and everything, whereas this is just for breads. And I'm talking from experience as somebody who has the #1 rated gluten-free bread machine, okay? Which was very kindly gifted to me in the first year after my diagnosis when I had done a ton of research about bread machines, and I'm very thankful for that, but I just need to tell you all the truth. If you're on the fence about buying a gluten-free bread machine, let me break down for you the pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. Everybody likes the pros. Pro. It's a bit less work, meaning that you're doing it all in one machine. It gets mixed in there, it rises in there, and there's no need to actually physically take it and put it into the oven. After it's done kneading, you can literally walk away and let it do its thing for a few hours and it's done. Pro, it doesn't take up any oven space. So if you want to bake a loaf of bread while you're making your big Thanksgiving feast, this is totally separate and it doesn't take up any room in your oven. Pro, the lower baking temperature and controlled environment of the bread machine creates a really soft and tender loaf. The first time I made my classic loaf in this machine, I actually thought that I had ruined it because it didn't brown up very much on top. But when I took it out and I sliced it, it was light and fluffy and, as always, delicious. Pro, I had actually never thought of this one, but for people who have a shared kitchen, meaning gluten-free and non-gluten-free, some people find it easier to keep the baking tools separate when they're using a bread machine. Think of it like a safe gluten-free bubble. No gluten gets in here. And finally, pro, typically bread machines are great because you can set them overnight and wake up to a freshly baked loaf of bread. But I don't do that because my bread recipes contain eggs and you wouldn't want those sitting out overnight. Now let's move on to the cons. Let me just start the cons off with a summary, which is that I don't think that the gluten-free bread machine saves as much time and effort as it would for regular bread. My first con, the paddles don't mix the dough as well as a stand mixer does, so you have to scrape down the sides of the pan, otherwise all of the flour won't get incorporated and it will stick to the sides of the loaf. Con, you can't change the kind of pan you're using. So for my gluten-free breads, I prefer to use a tall, narrow loaf pan, which is gonna give a taller loaf of bread, which is great for sandwiches. But in a bread machine, you are limited to the pan that comes with the bread machine, which typically is a wider pan, which is gonna give a shorter loaf. Con: I don't find that the shape of the loaf is as nice either. Part of that has to do with the fact that there is always at least one paddle, if not two, in the bottom of the loaf pan, which creates holes in the bottom of the loaf. So if you want to use it for sandwiches, there's going to be a few pieces that are wonky and have a little hole in them. This next con will depend on the type of bread machine you have. If your bread machine doesn't have custom cycles, then you may not be able to open it up and smooth out the top of the loaf or brush it with butter or egg wash before it bakes. This bread machine, because it has a shape cycle and a custom setting, I can open it up. Or for example, the Breville machine has a pause button, so you could do that. If you can't smooth out the top of the loaf, it's just not gonna look as nice. But it doesn't affect the taste. So, con: once the rise and bake cycle starts, it can't be adjusted. So typically when you're making a loaf of bread, if it needs an extra 10 minutes to rise, you just let it rise. If you see in the oven that it's not brown enough on top, you just leave it in. You don't have that same flexibility with a bread machine. Con: I actually find that it takes more time. Because I've developed my own method for making gluten-free bread, I can whip it up in about 90 minutes. With the bread machine, I find that it can take up to 3 hours. This is because of 3 things. So it has a longer knead cycle because it doesn't mix as well as the stand mixer. I have given it more rise time just because I can't adjust it if it does need more time. And because it bakes at a lower temperature, it takes longer to bake. Con: it doesn't save any time when mixing ingredients. So when you're making gluten bread in a bread machine, really the only dry ingredients you need are the flour and the salt. But with gluten-free breads, we have our flours and starches and binders and salt, baking powder, all of those extra ingredients. And because it doesn't mix as well, I recommend mixing them together in a bowl or a jar first. So it doesn't save any more time and you still have the same amount of dishes. Con: finding a good bread machine with a gluten-free setting or custom settings can be expensive, like $500 expensive. Con: eventually, you're probably going to need a replacement part for your bread machine, and they can be expensive or hard to find. And my final con: you can only make one loaf of bread at a time. With a stand mixer, depending on how big it is, you can make a double batch, use 2 loaf pans, and then you have 2 loaves of bread. With this, you only get 1. Also, please note that if you're baking for someone with celiac disease or someone who's affected by cross-contamination, you'll need to have a separate gluten-free bread machine. Even if your regular gluten bread machine has a gluten-free setting, don't just throw your gluten-free ingredients in there and call it a day. And if you're newly gluten-free and you already have a bread machine that you used for gluten bread, it's time to donate that one and get a new one. Or get a stand mixer. I want to add here that a lot of people think that you have to just make the recipes that come with the bread machine. And actually the reason why I stopped using my bread machine for so long was because I did not like the recipes that were in the book that came with it. I found that they lacked flavor and they dried out the next day. And then when I scoured the internet to find a good bread machine recipe, there was some egg-free one that I tried, and it turned out so bad that I've just vowed to not use it anymore. But I find that my bread recipes are equally delicious in the bread machine as they are in the oven. Anything you can do with the bread machine, you can just replicate in your oven, but you can't replicate what the stand mixer does in the bread machine.
Still delicious.
That's the thing. Tastes the same, texture is great, just doesn't look as pretty. There you have it, why you don't need a bread machine for gluten-free bread. All that said, I know that the pros still appeal to some people, or maybe you already bought a bread machine and want to put it to use. Lucky for you, the bread recipes in my new course are bread machine friendly. I have a whole section about bread machines and how to use them to get the best result. If you have any other questions about bread machines for gluten-free, let me know in the comments. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.